part 2 of an interview with Florian Geyer on Vatican II and the Culture War.
From the standpoint of both sides, whether you're a member of that, I'm trying to be looking from a human standpoint, is how human beings are treated. How, because I do think that millions of human beings were sacrificed for a greater new world order, called the world wars and these things. And it's what's that saying that it's the Trotskys that make the revolutions, the Bronsteins that pay for it. So they're being, they're as manipulated as the Goyim in many respects. But there was an acknowledgement, that there was writings, there was people, basic acknowledgement that there's always a problem dealing with the Jewish community because they tended to be subversive. They tended to, engage in what they call, usury, finance. The business ethics were in question. And they were always behind things like pornography, things like that. And there was the overall public morality, in a sense that because people did act corporately, they did live in communities, they lived in parishes, and they were collectively organized to restrain it. And they had the language they could use. They weren't disarmed linguistically. But since the Second World War, we've been denied that language. Because to question, to criticize a Jewish organization, to question Jewish behavior, to question Hollywood, to question the policies of Tel Aviv, is to be an anti-Semite, and to be an anti-Semite is to be a Nazi, because of the Holocaust narrative. But if you look at both world wars, Jewish bankers played a big part in fomenting those wars to create the crisis, to create a dialectic to get this very outcome that we're facing today. It's very alchemical.
Yeah, and I think that it's important to understand that things play on multiple levels, right? So there is, Jews are not a unipolar actor in terms of the subversive elements for the West, and this is one place where I actually catch a huge, this is going to sound crazy, but I catch a lot of heat from certain guys in the far right, because I don't actually think that it's the Jews alone who are basically to blame for the downfall of Western civilization. I think that as I said before, I think at the top level, those distinctions disappear. I think it's a matter of initiation and illuminism, and I think it's basically a spiritual thing. I think it's just, I take a pure religious view of it. I think it's basically just spiritual warfare. It's the devil. So straight up. But yeah, I want to quote to you, give you a Codreanu quote. So Corneliu Zelia Codreanu, leader of the Iron Guard in Romania, said very pithily, "A country has the Jews it deserves, just as mosquitoes can thrive and settle only in swamps. Likewise, the former can only thrive in the swamps of our sins." Now, you can apply that to any parasite. If you're shocked and offended, whatever. But it basically, the Jews have guilt, but it's us. It's nobody but us. The reason why the Jews were successful in subverting us and the Freemasons and all that is because of our own iniquity. It's never anything but that. The problem is human corruption. And so it's no political solution can solve that inherent problem, which is why I view it as fundamentally a spiritual question. Of course, there's political manifestations of that, but the spiritual battle is just about human sin and corruption. And what we have is certain predatory nations who have their survival strategy is basically profiting off of the corruption of man, because it's predictable and a very excellent method of controlling and exploiting him. Pussy is the most dangerous drug in the world.
Yeah, libido dominandi, yeah.
Yeah, libido dominandi. And if you control it, well, you can make a man do whatever you want.
Yeah, it's like sexual liberation of psychological warfare as a way to enslave you, and that's basically you incite the passions, and you enslave people to their passions. All you have to do is be in a position to provide those things that fulfill those passions or appetites. You can indeed control them.
Exactly. That's what the pedophilia is all about. Mm-hmm. It's a control mechanism. And it has been since the days of yore. I mean, it's, as you say, I mean, we can go, if we want to get real esoteric with it, I mean, we can go back to Babylon, old Babylon, and talk about the ziggurat and the Tower of Babel. And so the Babylonian theology of the ziggurat was that the pyramid was a physical gate into heaven. And it was built in such a mathematical, magical type way that every step, had a certain resonance with the spiritual world. And so you were literally ascending the ladder into heaven as you ascended to the top of the tower. And so the only ones who could go up to the top of the tower and commune with the gods were those who were initiated, the priests. Mm-hmm. Right? And you see where I'm going here is that and they basically get to say whatever they want.
Yeah.
And this is the message of the Tower of Babel, is that God just threw it out of them. And, just in typical style, right? And they fell and were crushed under its weight, which is what always happens, is the priests collapse when the tower or edifice crumbles. But that's what's going on, is that it's a matter of the priests controlling the doctrine and the priests, holding the key to initiation, or the elites, right? Mm-hmm. And so in our modern society, that the priesthood is techne, is occult knowledge, is initiation. And so that occult knowledge is maybe alchemical, or finance, geopolitics, people's dark personal secrets, all right? Knowledge of, sex trafficking, drug trafficking networks. That's power. That's occult, wizardry.
Yeah. And the alchemy of finance, right?
That's George Soros himself. Yeah. What is finance? Alchemy.
Alchemy. I mean, obviously, if you're in control of the banking system, ultimately you can control things like entertainment and mass communication, which will, as Edward Bernays, said, basically our appetites, our thoughts are controlled by men we never know. It constitutes a secret government. I'm butchering the quote, but that's the effect, and that's how we're being manipulated. But ultimately, you don't want to say that we're not responsible for ourselves, because that's just playing the victim.
Yeah, exactly, and that's the opposite of what we have to do. But rather, we have to be responsible, take responsibility, and repent.
But one thing that's important is we have to be conscious of sort of organized high-level malevolence.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely.
I mean, we can't just...
Why is the serpent innocent as doves?
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing, the good work that E. Michael Jones has done as far as the social engineering that occurred with the destruction of the ethnic neighborhoods. And depriving, you mentioned how in the past people they were born into a community. They weren't individuals. The American doctrine was individualism, but in practical sense, we're not. You're right, we can't be. That's just Enlightenment propaganda. None of us really act as individuals. Totally, that's ridiculous. Of course, none of us. We all. We're babies, and we take care of our babies. These things, but when you destroyed things like these ethnic neighborhoods, Irish Catholic neighborhoods, German Catholic neighborhoods, Polish, Italian Catholic neighborhoods, these little enclaves that weren't maybe quite on board, with the imperial agenda of the WASP elite of the Anglo-Zio Empire. So they had to be destroyed, and they were destroyed, through forced integration.
Mm-hmm. And that's what, it's about. It's a pragmatic, and that's it. It's about power. And so the goal of the 20th century was the destruction of every institution, national, racial, religious, or otherwise, that was capable of forming a coherent power block against the Western elites. And that is what has happened. Every single one has fallen. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Except for Russia.
Yeah, and that's a mixed bag too.
It is a mixed bag. I'm not saying it. Yeah, it's not black and white, but I think here's what I would say. I think Putin is an Orthodox Christian, and no other leader of the world, I think, is a serious Christian. And everything that you say, whatever you want about Putin, but I think that he is a serious Christian. And so that's, for me, in my personal opinion, that's his strongest merit, is that he actually has a worldview that's contrary to the Enlightenment one. Mm-hmm. And so that by fiat basically better than anybody else.
Mm-hmm. Now, we were talking, Chris, apply this to the culture war. What's going on now? We have utter insanity reigns. All types of sexual confusion, identity politics run amok. The utter destruction of the family. Of course, this was a stage. I think first they created the nuclear family, cut us off from our extended family and our communities. And once the family's atomized, then you can go to work on the individual members themselves. And now we have individuals that are completely atomized. How would you apply what's going on now to what we've been talking about?
Yeah, well, I mean, we talked about the breakup of the ethnic neighborhoods. I would say that Catholicism has been distinct in Orthodoxy in that it is always downplayed to a certain degree ethnicity and the ethnic differences in favor of the universal and the Catholic. Mm-hmm. And we can see this in the liturgy, whereas each Orthodox church uses its own language in the liturgy for the most part, and ought to. In the Catholic Church, they had the one universal Latin language, no matter what culture or religion was. And so I think that's if we've understood in depth what we were talking about in language beforehand, that should kind of say it all. And so what I think it happened exactly is that it's the homosexual question is basically at the heart of this, is that the destruction of the moral authority of the Catholic Church removed any higher standard for most people, even if it was kind of legalistic and and at its worst semi-tyrannical. At least it was something.
Yeah.
At least, if it was just a big bearded man in the sky with eyes 10,000 times brighter than the sun, boring at you, waiting for you to eat meat on a Friday so he can send you to hell, well, that's something. It's better than nothing. I mean, it's awful. It's
Yes.
really, really bad, but from a purely practical perspective, it gets people to stop doing a lot of bad stuff.
Yeah, I mean, we don't live in a world that's overrun or with guilt, do we?
No, right? And I would just say, it's like, well, is this shamelessness better,
Yeah.
right, than, the worst form of repressive Catholicism? Well, how much do you love marijuana? Maybe that'll influence your decision.
Mm-hmm.
But that practically is, it's all about the passions at the end of the day. I mean, usually that's what motivates our worldviews, getting what we want, right?
Well,
Whether it's
doesn't that
dope
go?
or anything else, right?
That goes to the weakness of part of the I could say part of the libertarian argument, because really it's all about restraining or channeling the passions in a productive, responsible way.
Absolutely.
And to them, it's all it sends if you just if you remove restrictions. That's the freedom's the answer. What's the question type approach? Well, it's a little more complicated than that. I mean,
right. Yeah. Well, to get back to the cultural warfare, right? And so, I think that what happened is that the removal of the Catholic Church's moral authority, especially by the wholesale infiltration of communists and homosexuals into the Catholic apparatus. We have the Emma Dodd, I think that was her name. Hearings in the U.S. Congress. This is a matter of U.S. congressional record of testimony. She was a former Communist Party member and testified that she personally helped, I think, 4,100, something absurd, like 1,400, some huge absurd number. Communists infiltrate the Catholic hierarchy in Canada and the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And you can go look into the work of Alice von Hildebrand on this. Dietrich von Hildebrand. And, so precisely. And so what happened, to give you an example, what I mean when I say, homosexual, I'm not being, hyperbole. It's one thing I want to disclaim for your listeners who might not be familiar with Mysterium Fasces, is we really, really try not to talk in hyperbole. We try to use technical and precise language. And so if it sounds extreme, that's because the situation is extreme. Mm-hmm. In Boston, half of retired priests died of AIDS. Okay? Mm-hmm. Now, right? The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, after the 2003 sex scandals, commissioned a report, I think it's by the J. Jones Investigative Institute in New York, to kind of see WTF was going on. And what they basically came up with was that in 65 to 85% of the instances of sexual abuse, there were two common factors. One, the children were post-pubescent, so between the ages of 12 and 16 to 17. And the priests who sexually abused them were active homosexuals and had multiple other male adult sexual partners.
Mm-hmm.
And so the problem is not actually pedophilia, it's homosexuality. And it's that, like for homosexuals, because there's no reproductive telos, it's just about pleasure, the young boy, the catamite, right, is the eminently desirable form. So how does this really relate? Well, it just comes back to the destruction of the matter of the authority of the institution. If you make it gay and unserious and womanly and weak, nobody's going to take it seriously. So why should they not fornicate and father bastards and, get HIV because it makes them feel good? I mean, there's no seriously.
Yeah, I mean, anyone who's had the benefit of knowing a sort of a manly, streetwise, orthodox priest will have a better relationship with the church.
Precisely.
Because that's their example, as opposed to the milquetoast, post-Vatican II priests at the seminaries. Yeah. And of course, I think the seminaries were purposefully infiltrated.
That's what I was saying with the Dodd thing. That's exactly what happened, is they were purposefully infiltrated. And so that's what was going on. I think we've come full circle because we've covered all the three groups: Freemasons, Jews, homosexuals, and significant interplay. Those are not discrete categories, right? They all blend. And so I would say that we can lay, and then naive liberals, I would say, are a big part, useful idiots. And in this case, they should know better, so we can convict them with absolute certainty. It's their job to know better, and so we can call them out for being incompetent to the point of being evil, Catholic prelates and so on, cowardly. And so that's the confluence would produce the Second Vatican Council. So it's much, I want to talk, if you don't mind, like a little hard theology on the council just to kind of get it out of the way, because I think it's important.
Okay.
Okay, so there's two, the big thing that Vatican II changed is it changed the ecclesiology. And that is to say, ecclesia comes from the Greek word for assembly or gathering. So just the church, how the church looks at itself and how it manages itself and how it looks at itself in comparison to other church bodies and whatever. And so the big change at Vatican II was that before Vatican II, the Catholics basically made the same claim as the Orthodox, which comes from the Council of Nicaea in the Nicene Creed, which says, I believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church.
Mm-hmm.
And the operative word there is one.
I say it every Sunday, yes.
Yes, right? One church, right? And so the Catholics would say, okay, well, we're it, and the guys who are in communion with the Pope of Rome and have the Catholic faith, that's the church. Whereas the Orthodox would say those who have the Orthodox faith, and have apostolic succession legitimately, we could say canonically, that is the church. They don't even necessarily need to be in communion with each other. They can be in schism and still both be the church.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so this is the thing, is that we both were on the same page. Vatican II changed that. And so what happened is the publication of Lumen Gentium, which is the Apostolic Dogmatic Constitution on the Faith, was basically their big document of council, which was setting down how the church sees itself and how it interacts with itself and interacts with others and its whole theology. And the big change was that they changed their self-identity. Before that council, even 20 years before, Pope Pius XII, I believe, in Mystici Corporis, had clearly said that the Church of Christ, established by Jesus Christ and the Apostles, is the Roman Catholic Church. The one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church is the Roman Catholic Church. Lumen Gentium says that it subsists in the Roman Catholic Church. Now, there's a matter of debate as to what this means. Pope Benedict would very famously say that the word subsist basically just means is. He says that they're synonyms. Whereas other serious mainstream academic Catholic theologians, Avery Dulles, for instance, argued, no, actually it represents a dogmatic change. No, this is really what they're saying, is that the Catholic Church is it just subsists. It has the fullness of the faith, the perfection of the faith, but also the church exists in other places. And so what they really are saying is that the Catholic Church, the one Church of Christ, is manifested in Protestant churches. And other churches as well. Might not even be Protestant. And this is totally new. It's novel. Absolutely. It's completely, like, they just made that up.
And,
right?
this leads to the idea that there are various roads to salvation.
Right. Ecumenism. It's what we call branch theory ecumenism, right? So this is the idea that the Church of Christ, or that the paths to salvation have essentially, like, branched off, at some point through the ages. And so, the traditional Anglican branch theory ecumenism is that there's, the Anglican, the Catholic, and the Orthodox, and they just kind of need to come together and put their blocks together, and then they'll just build a perfect Church of Christ how it always was meant to be.
That sounds that's like something a project that Rockefellers would be interested in.
That makes me think. Yeah, well, no, that's precisely, yes. Where did the World Council of Churches get their money, Tim? It's the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds. And who funded the Catholic Workers' Movement and the Catholic Liturgical Reform Movement? Any guesses?
I think it was a grassroots funding, a PayPal?
Yeah.
Indiegogo? I don't know what.
Bitcoin? Yeah.
Yeah. Rockefellers. Yeah.
It was the usual characters, the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds.
Rothschilds. So, who I guess initially funded Rockefeller, right? Rothschilds, the National City.
Well, yeah, of course, yeah. I mean, and that, as we said, at that level of finance, the liquidity of these distinctions don't really matter.
Yeah. And anyway, when we say Rockefeller, Rothschilds, at this point now we're talking about, that itself is kind of an abstraction now, because it's now there. Right. It's a whole, it's a elite clique. It's it's this elite of a few, it's kind of the social registry or something of elite bankers and all that, So.
Yeah, that's it. The initiates.
Bilderberg, Davos, whatever.
That kind of stuff. And so, and this is my personal opinion is that this is the biggest, and this is what this is also what sedevacantists believe, is that the institution of the Catholic Church post-Vatican II is a different institution by its own definition than that which preceded it. It's in fact a different religion, a different church. And they describe this as it's the Novus Ordo Church. Now, you may not believe this, you may be a Catholic who accepts this, but if you were an outsider, it certainly appears that way.
Mm-hmm.
If you went to, let's say 1900, Italy and world Catholicism, and you went and you looked at all of that religion, you did an anthropological report on that, and then you went to 2000 and you did that same thing, you would have two different religions.
Well, just my own living memory, when I was in Altarway back in the 70s, which is everyone still knelt for communion. We had communion rails. The churches were roughly the same. Of course, they were being built in the 60s and 70s. I mean, this probably speaks to also the architecture itself of the.
Oh my goodness! Don't even get me started, dude.
So the music, right? The folk music and.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're right, because this is where you talk about the importance of symbolism.
Yes.
In architecture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Language, right? Precisely. And so this is it. And it's, I would actually argue that architecture is the most important form of art because it's a public good. And it is the matter of people's civilization. When you think of Italy, you think of their architecture and their landscape, right? When you say the same thing with London or like France, when when I say to you, like Greece, like what images pop into your mind?
Oh, the Parthenon,
Right, the Parthenon, the nice white houses with, blue roofs, right? Nice weather, beautiful oceans, old Greek men sipping wine and smoking cigarettes, right? At 6 o'clock in the morning. Right, that kind of stuff. And so, absolutely. And so the degeneration of Catholic architecture is worthy of tears and lamentation. Worthy of tears and lamentation.
Well, that follows the degradation, the destruction, the slow death of the church itself. Yeah, because.
And that's my thesis. That's why I wanted to touch on the theology. It's because my personal opinion is what I think is that Vatican II, not only does it teach heresy, but I think that the biggest problem is it's institutional. It's ecclesiological. It's that the church doesn't really claim in the fullness. It doesn't have the fullness of the claim as what it used to be. We're dealing with a different institution. And I know that Roman Catholics that are in communion with Rome obviously don't accept that. That's fine. You don't have to accept my opinion. But to an outsider, you'd have a hard time making the claim that pre-Vatican II and post-Vatican II Catholicism are the same religion.
I was where I was an altar boy. It was an old style cathedral style church built in the 40s.
Right.
Beautiful church, and they had a marble communion rail.
Right.
They tore it up in the 80s.
I'm sure they did.
I'm sure
they threw it in the trash.
That's malicious.
They threw altars. They threw altars with relics in the trash. Okay.
Well, yeah.
Listen. Liturgical abuse is one thing that makes me violent, and I don't get that way about very many things. Okay. But liturgical abuse, it arouses my wrath. It's unspeakably disgusting. And what they did, they will pay for it. Surely, the Lord God of hosts will judge them on the last day.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, no, so that's what I would say is that's the dealio with Vatican II, long and short, is that it was, as you say, alchemical. It was the reduction of any Christian restraining authority in the West. And once that had been destroyed, once the last vestiges of any real tradition had been done away with, all that was left was the worldview and the language of our enemies, which is nihilism, essentially.
Or pragmatism.
Well, pragmatism is not. Yeah, I mean, pragmatism
it is.
It's realistic nihilism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's like, well, if you don't blow your brains out right away, I mean, what are you going to do with yourself? That's what pragmatism is.
Yeah. Which is, I guess, is an outgrowth of British empiricism.
Yes, yeah. Precisely.
Which grows out of the Newtonian world.
Indeed.
But if you're running an empire based on slavery, human destruction through opium, you don't want the universe to be teleological, do you?
No, of course not. Right? Yeah, that would imply that you have some sort of duties, noblesse oblige, that kind of stuff. Yeah, no, precisely. I mean, precisely. And this is the thing: is the argument of monarchists essentially is that if you don't have monarchy, you have oligarchy, and that if you don't have a single person who is more powerful than anybody else in the state, and that uses that power to enforce the common good, then ultimately that means that the oligarchs are just going to do everything that they can to aggrandize power to themselves. And the thing about these guys is that they're absolutely chameleons. They're absolutely chameleons. They don't really believe in anything. And so that's how the industrialists could support Adolf Hitler, from the beginning, and then right after the war totally integrate themselves into the, Western capitalist, international finance system and make themselves, indispensable in these, Swiss banking houses in German revival.
Yes.
They never cared to begin. It was just, they just wanted their money. It was comfort politics. They didn't want the Reds to come in and liquidate their property and shoot them in the back of the head. Which, maybe they had the right idea.
Yeah, and this is why, I guess the Warburg family could have no problem controlling IG Farben.
Right. And so this is it. And it's, this is another issue that, once again, I take some flack from, in certain National Socialist circles because I think that it's very important that we address the fullness of the picture, especially with Adolf Hitler and the NSDAP, is that, what we're dealing with is merchants. It's what it comes back to. At the end of the day, the enemy is that merchant mindset, that pragmatist, that worship of mammon, that lust for power, right? And what's happened is that lust for power that's the whole worldview. Yeah, auto-deification.
Venetian vipers.
Yeah, exactly. Venetian vipers.
The black nobility is supposedly.
Supposedly, yeah.
But, it's, I forget where we were on that.
We were talking about the cultural warfare and the the promiscuity and all that, what we're seeing today.
Well, it's, we're, a good example, we've had this latest thing with Harvey Weinstein, right? in Hollywood.
Should I quote Larry David?
Yeah, I saw that. Talking about, is that a live thing?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's like, something's very weird about all of these sexual molesters. I'm starting to notice a pattern here.
I read an article by Kevin McDonald about that. he was talking about, he was talking about Philip Roth's book, Portnoy's Complaint.
Yeah, I think I heard him on Red Ice discussing this.
Yeah, that's why I read the article. Listened to the interview, and I think that's an important. I don't think it's the only thing, but it's an important dimension to it.
Obviously,
because Portnoy's Complaint, of course, that's a movie with the book, of course, by Philip Roth, adapted to a movie starring Richard Benjamin, and of course, I think Woody Allen's Annie Hall was based on that. But you have this. Should we say a penchant or a desire to degrade? And this is something I think this is why Jews have always played a prominent role in things like pornography.
Right.
And a good example is how society was deprived of a way to defend against that. One thing was the Roth decision, in the 1950s, which.
If I may recommend an exceptional series of articles. They're entitled "The Jew as the Adversary in the Battle Over Obscenity and Pornography" by Benjamin Garland.
Okay, you have to look. Yeah, that's an important because it's like abortion.
So
right?
if you're you don't have to be a National Socialist in order to acknowledge Jewish influence. And those series of articles are extremely well documented and highly disturbing and very enlightening.
Well, Jews themselves have written books about how Jews.
Well, it's mostly Jewish articles.
Yeah.
Mostly what the guy does is just you talk about Jews in their own words. You don't have to you can just do honestly. We could just quote the Jewish Daily Forward and not have any problems with the discussion that we're speaking of right now.
Mm-hmm. But if we do it, we're anti-Semitic.
Right.
They do it, but they look at it as a sort of progressive, liberating thing.
Of course. Well, it's Slezkin, Jewish century, right? I mean, it's a great thing. It's great that the Jews did all these excellent things, right? I mean, they brag about it.
Mm-hmm.
So.
But
that's the way it is.
But then, you have of course, you have the Rockefellers promoting, characters like Kinsey in the 1950s, putting him on the cover of Time magazine. I think we should look in the backing. Playboy magazine had CIA backing.
Absolutely.
But so did Ms. Magazine, and so did National Review, right?
Yeah. I'm seeing a connection here, Tim.
Well, it goes back to everything's within the lodge, isn't it?
Well, that's it. I mean, and it's, honestly, every time I have these discussions, it always goes back to John Dee and the Royal Society. Because you can't understand Freemasonry and you can't understand the way the modern scientific world is set up unless you understand the Royal Society. And so the Royal Society of London was basically the premier empiricist institution and the harbingers of the English, the British Enlightenment. And they were all hard alchemists and Kabbalists. And if, on my podcast we've discussed before how alchemy became introduced into Europe. And it comes from the Kabbalah.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, that's a fact. I mean, and they admit this. And especially the Jews of Prague and their influence over the Holy Roman Emperor and his court, and especially the court of Elizabeth, and especially after Cromwell, things really started to get intensely spicy because there was the formal ban on Jews was lifted. And now, again, it's important. I mean, we can't reduce everything to Jews, but there is this line, this connection runs through history,
mm-hmm.
and it cannot be ignored if you're going to have a serious worldview or understanding of geopolitics and how things got to the way they are.
Mm-hmm.
So,
mm-hmm. Of course, and with the Royal Society, it's all about occulted knowledge, secreted knowledge, otherwise known as magic or black magic. Right, that's the difference. Who's
right.
Arthur C. Clarke, who said there's no fundamental distinction between advanced technology and magic, because if you don't know the physical principles behind it, it does appear as magic. If I were to take my smartphone and show it to someone in 1900, they would think it was magical, because
well, it is.
Right. And in a way it is. In a way it is magical, right? Yeah. So.
Well, I mean, if you had taken your smartphone and you went to somebody in 2000,
Yes, exactly. I know. I don't even have to go back a century. You're right.
Right? I mean, 1999. It's like, what? Future, dude.
And look at you're watching a movie under.
Yes. No, sorry, boys. We only have tranny soldiers. It's really gay in the future.
But a lot of this is because it's of course this goes back to the function of technology, which takes us back to the Royal Society. I guess you suppose the sort of this you could say a Faustian bargain that humanity has made, Western man had made with technology. Because if you look, let's take pornography, for example. Pornography cannot have the effect it has unless you have the technology of photography, moving pictures, and then go to the internet. Because without that, you can have a room, but only so many people can see it, right? It's limited. It's the technology which enables this. And the big breakthrough probably was with moving pictures, because the shock that it would have had on people's sensibilities to be able to put a nickel in a Nickelodeon, and it's kind of funny that a children's show is called Nickelodeon. Children's channel is called Nickelodeon. When those Nickelodeons were primarily pornographic, I think in Philadelphia or something. It
makes me wonder about this Dan Schneider character and his whole Nickelodeon connection. Anyway, I digress. Go on.
Yeah. But the history of the cinema itself has always been one of mind control and degradation.
Propaganda, precisely. Yeah. No, and I think the latest episode of Mysterium Fasces, we discussed this topic exactly, and I discussed the relationship between spiritual evil, the demonic, and technology, and what we call the New World Order, basically. And I went back and I used the example of the antediluvian civilization, Atlantis or Old Babylon, after the flood, as basically the model, the icon. And we know, from the Book of Enoch and from many sources, that the pre-flood civilization probably had technology more sophisticated than our own. And so I think that there's a very, very tight association between mechanization and death.
Well, yeah, we saw that in the 20th century.
Yeah, World War I is proof.
Yep.
Just look at No Man's Land. That's Hades. Mm-hmm. You want to know hell's real? You're living in it, bud. That's how you know. And so, yeah, there's a very close association. Because the further you mechanize something and you leverage the rules of nature in order to direct power in a certain way, to channel power in a finer and finer manner, the further away you get from our natural language, from what we understand and see in nature, from an organic lifestyle. And now I'm not anti-technology. I'm not a Luddite. It's a matter of who holds it and the spirit that animates the technology, which is the venture. And so if movies are used to promote beauty and art and culture and truth, that's excellent, right? Laudable and commendable. A fantastic innovation. But of course, that's a two-edged sword.
Yeah, in the past, of course, you had the legions of decency. You had Joseph Breen in Hollywood, who pretty much spoke the truth about the people who ran Hollywood, I think. They're all degenerates. They're all, but they're controlling the entertainment fair. But the whole idea of I've had a couple of discussions regarding this. The idea of first you have the production code that's first enforced by the Protestants and by the Catholics with legions of decency, largely backed by the authority of the Roman Catholic Church, and in these ethnic neighborhoods, to say don't go to that movie. If the bishop said don't go to that movie, you wouldn't go to that movie. And people responded to his authority in that regard. So Hollywood had to genuflect to church authority there, and they hated it. This also, there's no coincidence that the production code collapsed in the mid-'60s after the process of suburbanization had destroyed the ethnic neighborhoods. That sort of, because that sort of diaspora in the suburbia produced this deracinated white majority.
Exactly. Exactly.
And that's that's very New World Order, if you ask me. So, but
I agree. So I'm very anti-white nationalist. It's because it's a ridiculous ideology.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because we do hear a lot of talk about that European identity or white nationalism. How? Yeah. To me, that's not much to stand in, because that itself is sort of a denatured, deracinated product of the.
It's a zoological category. You're right. It's an empirical, scientific category. Yeah. Right. So here's the way I like to describe it. I think that your blood, phenotype, race, whatever you want to call it, that's the foundation of a nation. But nobody sleeps on a concrete slab. You put up a door, you have walls, a roof, furniture, and all that.
Yeah.
But the foundation is cracked, then that nation is doomed. The house is condemned. It's just a matter of time, whether it's now or in 100 years, that it's going to fall apart, right? It's not stable. And so, because the regularity, the predictability that comes out of race, of phenotype, leaves it. Mm-hmm. And so it becomes erratic, it becomes schizophrenic, and we can even see this empirically in like mixed race children, as they have much, much higher rates of all sorts of mental illnesses and also like neurological illnesses, personality disorders, that kind of stuff. You know, and so I think that it's just a fact. And so, yeah, and I think that you're right, and is that the like ethnos is based on a lot more than just race. It's based on a whole integrated worldview, and economic, you know, geographic, historical, liturgical bond, right? Mm-hmm. And that's precise. And so the idea that the zoological category of whiteness alone is enough to create an identity is like ridiculous. It's just it's nonsense, a claptrap.
It doesn't exist. Yeah. It's like, remember the movie The Jerk? It's your diet, your tab, and your Twinkie. If you remember that movie.
Yeah.
You know, it's an old movie. I'm dating myself, but not a particularly good movie either. But I'm saying the idea is that there is, I mean, I guess from standing back from a certain distance, you could identify a white culture in America.
Sure.
But that's pretty vague.
Yeah, I agree. I think that they're like whiteness is like a biological reality, and then we can see that in terms of the outcomes of the descendants of European people because they cluster so close together in comparison to the other racial groups. And so you're right, whiteness is a category of opposition. The idea of white people only came into existence when European settlers came to the New World and encountered, you know, groups of Negroes and mestizos and so on.
Yeah.
Right. And so, you know, that's like for me, because an Orthodox Christian, I see fundamentally, I think that the solution is religious. So I agree with Jay Dyer on this point, you know, and I think that that's the big solution to this crisis, is to give people a coherent, integrated worldview. You know, and then in terms of, you know, the National Socialism, I mean, well, the nation starts with your family.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, people get really concerned and have these identity crises, but in North America, as I understand, right, because of the cosmopolitanization, the sodomization. But like, listen, you want to have a meaningful identity, you want to start a new nation, one that's healthy and organic, start in your household. That's your nation, right? And so, you know, I think that the difficulty is that this is a pretty unprecedented situation where we have an almost totally atomized civilization with no logos except economic. I think the only like comparison we can make is kind of like maybe old Babylon. I'm going to go ahead and say.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Dutch settlers were white, and so were the British, who during the Boer War they were both white, right? British soldiers and Dutch soldiers were both white. Irish.
Yeah, and that's it, right? Anyway, it's absurd, right? Mm. But that's the thing, is that, well, you know, white, when people say white, capital W, they don't really mean that as a zoological classification. They mean that as a stand-in for European identity. Right, which is basically Christianity. It's the political moral ethos of Christianity, and then also the Roman Empire, and in the West, Germanic oral tradition and written tradition, which we receive in the form of a constitution. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, white culture in North America is a synthesis of those three things. But yeah, no, I mean, it's, you know, we can talk about this and address it. I mean, people really get really flappy about it, you know, because it's like a very emotionally charged issue. But yeah, I mean, I think that ultimately, you know, here's it comes down, like it's like this, okay? You know, even among members of the so-called alt-right, there are people who fervently advocate abortion, especially for non-white populations.
Yeah, I've come across that. Right. It's disturbed me greatly.
Well, it's a very, very common argument. Yeah. Right? But there are also people on the so-called alt-right who want to put abortionists and those who promote those kind of ideas to death. Mm-hmm. So, you know, and they're both white, they're both, you know, ostensibly far right, they both ostensibly are, you know, sort of hip to the JQ and so on, have the same enemies. Yet their worldviews are diametrically opposed to one another and demand violence against one another. And in one's eyes, both actions are categorical evils.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's basically, that's the long and the short of it, is that there's no a coherent ethnos based on blood and soil, history, religion, all that. I mean, you can't just pull it out of your arse.
Well,
right?
I mean, this gets to the fundamental flaw, I guess, of the American experiment.
Yep.
This
exactly.
Propositional nation, right?
Yep. That's it.
Now
it's like Vatican II heresy. It's just making shit up.
Yeah. I mean, you could say at America's founding, America was much more decentralized. It didn't become heavily centralized until, you could say, arguably the New Deal and into the 1950s and 60s, and these things.
Well, fair whiskey rebellion. I mean, it was centralized enough to shoot farmers who were protesting the tax representation.
Immediately,
Mysterium Fasces, an episode of on American nationalism, which got us censored from the Daily Stormer, by the way.
Yeah, I listened to that. I can see why it did.
Yeah, it's really you begin to see what I'm talking about when I say these worldview issues, right?
But I mean, in the United States, in this decentralized ideal.
Right.
You had,
which I support, actually. I'm a supporter of, organic government, but I believe, as limited government as possible. I think self-rule is the most important thing, but that only comes when you have self-discipline and mastery, which comes from the heart. Mm-hmm. And so it's a religious affair by definition. Freedom is a religious matter. It's a spiritual question.
And, I mean, even the doctrine of separation of church and state, which isn't in the Constitution.
No, it's not. In fact, many states had official churches. New England had an official church until like the 1820s, I believe.
Exactly, which goes to the argument that perhaps the model of the founding was much more practical because it was decentralized, and you could have within it something as big as a state. You could have something like closer to Spain or Portugal, where it is a Catholic state. Because it is a Catholic
Maryland was set up specifically to be that, to be a Catholic state.
Yeah, and so that's...
sorry, go ahead.
No, I was saying in its decentralized form. So much of the problems we're seeing today, I think, is a product of sort of this imperial project of concentration, of power, of centralization, where you have simply people who don't want to, perhaps shouldn't live together, being forced to live together.
Of course.
And
I mean, it's very simple. It's diversity and proximity is conflict every time. That's how it is.
Now, who wants that?
Okay, I want to talk about when people really like to get offended about when people say the word race war. Okay, but what they mean by race war? Race is an old term for nation.
Yeah.
Okay, and so that just means that when you have two opposing groups in a limited geographical area competing over limited physical resources, they're going to come into conflict. That's called warfare. Right? And so in the United States and in other places with high levels of diversity, when the bread and circuses come off, when the economic surplus goes away, they will compete over the limited resources that are left, and there will be race war, right? So you don't exactly have to carve a swastika into your head like Charles Manson in order to believe in order to see that that's just that's how human beings work. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Whether you like it or not. And so the thing about white is that it's a category more of perception than of reality. And so, and I think it's the same thing with the alt-right, is that they're a category of opposition rather than of substance. Yeah. And so white exists in opposition to black.
But, I mean, the white category has been created, which is why you see so much anti-white stuff on television, commercials. So,
Yeah, but my point is just that, for your average black dude, right? I mean, he knows what a white guy is.
Yeah.
And a lot of you say, well, okay, I'm actually a mixed race Irish German, right? He's going to convince him you're not a white dude, right?
Yeah.
And when it comes down to, okay, listen, honky, white guys are not allowed in this neighborhood, it's not going to matter a fig.
No, yeah.
Anyway, but I mean, I'm glad to discuss this topic if you want to continue. I mean, we can go back to Vatican II.
Well, I mean, it goes to the same thing, because I do think some of the demographic problems that the country faces, some of these, I think these fomented ethnic racial problems that are stored.
Yeah, so on purpose for sure.
Yeah, or is a product of largely. I mean, I think it's largely is a product of the attempt to weaken the Catholic Church there's influence in America by changing the country's demographic warfare.
Exactly.
And we see demographic warfare, weaponized migration going on in Europe. And I do think it's occurring here in the United States. It's been done from time to time, because we mentioned the destruction of the urban neighborhoods. This was done under the guise of integration, which is progressive, but it was I think ultimately had a malevolent purpose with a very progressive wrapping to it.
If I might cite the Bible.
Sorry, go ahead.
When the Assyrians invaded the kingdom of Israel, the 10 tribes in the north, and destroyed them, they used a mass migration into that territory to racially mongrelize and ethnically, religiously, syncretically dilute the Israelite faith. And that's how the Samaritans became Samaritans. That's the history of them. And so this is like, it's not some sort of new tactic. It's a very, very old and classically understood idea. I was talking to a good friend of mine who's an Indian chief, an Aboriginal chief in the Northwest Coast, and he was, anybody who's woke on this question agrees as well. Yeah, of course, race is everything. With Indians especially, is that once you get race mixing, that's it. It's done. You can't go back. Culture's over. It's destroyed. Because once and that's just the long and the short of it, is that the blood is not trivial.
Okay,
and now populations, right? It's eminently destructive.
Now, for several decades, it's become a sort of a canon of liberal progressive thought that race mixing is a celebration of tolerance and diversity. It's this is, I think, another example of an idea that's been weaponized.
Yes.
If it doesn't matter, why is it being promoted?
Indeed.
That's you have to ask yourself that. Now, I'm not in the business of going around and telling people who they should marry, who they should date. I do think if you have strong ethnic identity, which isn't molested or disrupted by social engineers and psychopathic oligarchs paying them to do that, people will default to that anyway, because they'll have.
Well, they want to marry people that look like that.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with that. I knew a guy, Chinese guy, went to high school with. His father was Chinese, and he came. A typical story. He left the disruptions of China in the mid 20th century, came to America on the West Coast, worked his ass off, and prospered. But he wanted to remain. He wanted his family to remain ethnically Chinese. Now, it's more difficult, I understand, if, say, you are a successful, if you're successful Chinese or successful black, that your pool is going to be dwindled as you rise up the economic ladder. And you so you'll have less choices. This individual, that's what happens. But when his son married a woman of European background, he was upset. I don't think he was a racist for that. There's nothing wrong.
I mean, that's a word.
I mean, racist in the pejorative sense. I mean,
well, yeah. Exactly. It's like this. It's very simple.
There's nothing wrong with that.
It's that like familial clan identity is based on blood as well. That's part of it. And so, like, what happens is that, like, when you choose a different blood group, then that's not just like somebody, it'd be one thing if it was a Korean, right? Even that's bad enough, for Chinaman, right? But when you choose somebody totally radically different, you're choosing a different civilization, a different life, and so it's not a question of his capriciousness. It's that his son has decided to leave the family. He's created a new family with a new blood identity that is a new cultural identity. The mother is not going to raise her half Chinese children in a way that's fundamentally European. That's absurd.
Now, again, right? Would you want to go to a Chinese restaurant that had European waiters and waitresses?
Oh, it's the goods. You need to walk away if you ever want to enter one of those. One of my best friends is a Chinaman. One of my best friends is a Chinaman. He was here the last week, and we were discussing this subject, the National Socialism and race mixing. Well, and he's just as disgusted by it as anybody else is. And so, I mean, Chinese are notoriously politically incorrect, and so they'll
Yes.
stuff. That's why I like them so much, is because they don't care.
That's why you get along with them.
Yes, exactly. Right? Honesty is the foundation of all friendships, I firmly believe. I mean, because if you're honest about your differences, you know, and you're not like a little bitch, you know, you can get along.
But, I mean, there's your differences. You can respect differences. You just have to respect boundaries.
Right.
Which only problem with, I mean, if I might digress, when you talked about a race war being, you know, a fight over dwindling resources in the specific area, the only problem with the Anglo-Zaire Empire is they consider the whole world that area.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. Is that they want a world order, precisely. And so nationalism is antithetical to that because it has a very limited purview, sometimes extremely limited, right? Mm-hmm. You know, if you're like a Swiss nationalist, right, or Catalan nationalist, like you know, you're dealing with, like, you know, an area like the size of Long Island and Metro New York City. So, you know, it's not very big, mm-hmm. right? You know, and so it's precisely. And then, you know, this is why, I mean, even, you know, you go back to Carol Quigley, right? Mm-hmm. And all that, you see, you know, what was the threat to the New World Order? Well, it was nationalism, because it's multipolar.
But nationalism is bad because it's nationalism that created World War II, right?
Right. Well, now that's the thing, is that if they could use the nationalism to foment conflict, right, and to eat itself, which is exactly what happened, right, mm-hmm. is that the nationalist regimes perished in World War I and World War II. The traditional regimes were manipulated into destroying themselves, right, to the benefit of we know who, right?
But there are countries like Portugal and Spain which were neutral.
Right, to their intense advantage. And we can
yes.
see that Spain, right, we can see that Spain was a nationalist state and thrived and prospered under Franco and Salazar. Well, both of them were fascists, so to speak. I mean, you could say, well, Salazar was explicitly you know, almost a clerical, not quite, but they were all far right regimes, right? Mm-hmm. You know, and so it's, and both of them basically were sabotaged, right? And in Portugal, it was a military coup, and in Spain, it was ultimately because Franco lost the authority because the Vatican II came out against it, basically.
Yes, that's right, in 1970, and then he died in 75. And if you look at the demographic, which... And those, I mean, even the economy is horrible there now. But I'm saying if you look at the demographics, since they adopted the liberal constitution of the West, you've had the same situation in the United States. It's much worse, though. You have negative population growth. You have the destruction of the Catholic faith in Spain, the loss of that. So, if anything, the results of post-Franco Spain actually is a testimony to his reign.
Absolutely. And so, yeah, I mean, and that's it. And so I think that I think it's kind of interesting because are you familiar with William S. Lind?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm a big fan of William S. Lind, and I think that the key transition, I'm going to use these terms extremely euphemistically, so please nobody write to me angrily calling me a Duganist or a national Bolshevik. Okay?
He's on that the third generation warfare or fourth generation warfare?
Yeah,
doctor?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, that's the right one.
I think that the key difference between third and fourth political theory, so to speak, or what we could call the modern application of ideology or modern governance and postmodern governance, is that I think that postmodern resistance to the New World Order will be even more decentralized than the nation. Mm-hmm. And I think so that's basically the way I think it's going to shake out. And I think that the things that are going to command loyalty will be even more powerful than the nation. And so I think that basically it's going to go back to religion, because that's the only thing that's going to have a strong enough horse to counter sex bots and, the unlimited.
I mean, I don't know. Yeah, it's like it's the liberal order, kind of the reductio ad absurdum of the liberal world order. Where we're looking
honestly, here's the thing. Like, you want to know what the mystery Babylon is? The end of the initiation? You want to know what the great secret is? Is butt sex. That's it. It's butt sex. I mean, it sounds flippant, but it's true. Right? And it's butt sex both, like, actually physically, but spiritually. It's just like a, masturbatory pleasure that you get at the debasement of somebody else, and you're the master, and you just do whatever you want, and everything's just kind of nihilism. And so you just be God. That's the end of the Freemasonic initiatic chain. You follow Aleister Crowley, make your own religion.